Yes, phenomenology certainly needs no introduction. If I say most of the contemporary philosophical projects in one way or another is closely related to phenomenology, I think that won't be an exaggeration, because the main concepts and methods of all postmodern theory and philosophy are either a systematic response to phenomenology or a reaction to phenomenology. So that is the contemporary scenario about how we get to know about phenomenology. So I like to begin this lecture with a tentative definition of phenomenology, which tries to arrive at an understanding of man and the world from a very unique standpoint. So in this lecture, we will explore the nature of this unique perspective that phenomenology offers us to conceive man and the world to its originality. We will pose three different sets of questions. First, we will seek out the origin of phenomenology. Here we will ask, where does phenomenology come from? Or what were its antecedents? Second, we will describe the operations and concepts of phenomenology. Here we will ask, what were the principal operations that phenomenology undertook, and what are its main concepts? And finally, we will discuss the relation between phenomenology and literature. We will see how phenomenology approaches literary text. So 3 points: origin, operation and concepts, and the interdisciplinary avenue. With these three means, we will attempt to explore phenomenology. I think the best way to situate the origin as well as the antecedents of phenomenology is to describe the renowned Kantian Copernican revolution in philosophy. Because phenomenology is a response to the complicated problem of self, which this famed Kantian revolution opened up. The other day, Professor Sanal's elegant account of Kantian critical philosophy has given us enough resources to understand the Copernican revolution. Today, we will discuss how phenomenology has emerged from this minute space that Kant opened up. So Kant's magnum opus, Critique of Pure Reason, discusses the limit of human knowledge. The entire work can be minimized into one simple question: what can I know? Kant did not ask the profound question, what is knowledge? For Kant, what is knowledge should be asked only little later, because that question demands that we know the conditions of possibility of knowledge. In other words, the true import of Kantian revolution consists in his attempt to drain the significance of the traditional or the classical question, what is knowledge? For Kant, any question about the possibility of experience in general and in knowledge in particular has to be addressed after clarifying the question, who is man? To put it differently, Kant would insist that before we seek to know what knowledge is, we should examine man as the condition for the possibility of knowledge. This systematic distortion of priorities is known as the Copernican revolution in philosophy. As a result, as Foucault says, in philosophy, for the first time, it was necessary to sort out the nature of human condition to explore the condition of experience and knowledge. This is why, since 18th century, that is after the publication of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, the analysis of human consciousness become the standard modality of all philosophical inquiries. See, if we look back to the classical philosophy, it is very difficult to find the question about human consciousness or self. The other day in his lecture, Dr. Padiath has mentioned the nature of the classical inquiries, and especially how classical discourses conducted the metaphysical project of infinity. As we have seen in this lecture, in classical philosophy, man never occupied the prime position. On the contrary, we were portrayed as a living, speaking, tool-making being, but we were explored as the defective or deficient being comparing to the infinite being God. This comparison is the signature feature of classical and especially scholastic philosophy. So to say, in classical philosophy, we were viewed from the perspective of God. And the Copernican revolution or Kant has freed us from this theological prosthetic. Let's say the real genius of Kant lies in giving an account of the world and man from the man's standpoint. Thereby, Kant could reverse the perspectives. Now, man sees man within the bounds of his limit. God is no more the guarantor of truth or knowledge. Thanks to Kant, we no more talk about eternal truth, but universal truth. And precisely here, Kant defines the nature of man, who later becomes the subject of all modern epistemic and metaphysical inquiries. For Kant, the expression man suits only to a being who tries to step beyond the boundaries of empirical conditions. For example, the name man suits only to a being who wish to go beyond the behavioral and cultural conditions of our knowledge. It suits only to a being that wish to seek normativity of moral laws beyond the natural order. Thus, in modern philosophy, the word man or human is a very loaded expression. Michel Foucault has diagnosed the nature of this Kantian caricature of man elegantly. He says that man is a wrinkle or a scar on the face of knowledge. Man is a wrinkle because man, who is the condition for the possibility of knowledge, is not an object of knowledge. The point from where objects and knowledge are disclosed is not given as an object of knowledge. That is to say, the figure of man who tries to conceive himself within the limits of his own condition meets a difficulty. The self or the I is not given. If I reframe the difficulty that modern philosophy faces in the Kantian terms, we will say, Kant will say, no phenomenon gives us a glimpse of the vast land of noumenon called I. No phenomenon gives us a glimpse of the vast land of noumenon called I. So the whole problem can be better understood if we get the detail that Kant adds to Descartes' dictum cogito ergo sum, or I think therefore I am. For Descartes, the thinking I is an indubitable fact, and it's an object of immediate knowledge. To Descartes, who confidently claims that he knows at least one indubitable fact to ground knowledge, Kant would say, knowledge does not require a firm ground, and its original ground, man, itself is not an object of knowledge. Kant, with his Copernican revolution in philosophy, could point out the big gap in the Kantian account of cogito, or the thinking self. Thereby, Kant could open up a radical possibility of thought, which he himself did not explore much. How is it possible to disclose the structure of the knowing subject? What is the structure of our relation to the world? I think these two questions take us to phenomenology. What is of importance to phenomenology is the minute possibility that Descartes and Kant left out. Phenomenology tries to invent the possibility to describe the structure of our relation to the world and the mediated aspect of our consciousness. It conjoins both the Cartesian confidence and the Kantian spirit. Thus, phenomenology aims to disclose the non-objectifying, non-theoretical understanding of human experience. Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, could see such a subtle possibility. Heidegger could see it, and Merleau-Ponty too. And they have opened up a new discourse on subjectivity. Here I like to mention that phenomenology does not disagree with Kantian critical philosophy or Cartesian philosophy. Rather, phenomenology only furthers their projects of philosophy. Phenomenology, with its best effort, radicalizes their spirit. If Kant adds a subtle but important aspect of cogito, phenomenology tries to disclose a more fundamental aspect of cogito that both Descartes and Kant missed in their analysis. And we, as modern thinkers, owe to these additions. What are these additions? What is this fundamental or primordial aspect of consciousness? Or how is phenomenology trying to disclose the primordial aspect of consciousness, and how is it radicalizing this possibility? That takes us to the second part, the concepts and operations of phenomenology. As we have seen earlier, when we pose the tentative definition of phenomenology, the signature feature of phenomenology is its effort to open up a unique perspective to describe the subtlety of the world and man. And to meet this purpose, phenomenology has chosen to explore the first person perspective. All our experience is given to us in first person perspective, right? Let's say first person perspective is the distinctive way of mental state present themselves to us. And phenomenology works on this first person perspective and its different possibilities. Of course, outside philosophy and outside phenomenology, the notion of first person perspective or subjectivity is understood as something pertaining to that which lacks objectivity. For example, in our day-to-day conversation, we usually say, "Oh, don't take that comment seriously. It was just a subjective opinion or a remark." See, our common sense understanding use subjectivity as an adjective to our idiosyncratic opinion or preferences. Thus, we are advised to put aside such accounts in the pursuit of scientific understanding of the world and man. But for phenomenology, subjectivity and its essential characteristic feature, the first person perspective, is something that requires a close investigation. Phenomenology will call this irreducible aspect of our consciousness mindness or forminess. Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, defines man or the subject in relation to this irreducible aspect. For him, to be a subject is to be in the mode of being aware of oneself. In other words, the characteristic feature of our experience is that it always appears to me, and it always also allows me to be conscious of myself. Experience appears for always it appears for someone. There is always a minus aspect to our experience. Allow me to complicate the problem with an example. For example, when I burn myself on a candle, I spontaneously take the sensation of burning to be in my finger, not in the candle. As I burn my finger, I do not touch a pain that would be present in the flame like one of its properties. The pain is wholly mine, right? The brazier does not burn itself when it burns. The brazier does not scream out of pain. Neither the pain has a slight confusion about its owner, right? The pain is always mine. And only with appeal to this mineness, I can confidently claim that the particular experience of burning on the candle is mine. That's how I own an experience. That's how I buy an experience. However, this significant feature of human experience, that is minus or the first forminus or the first person perspective, is a tacit phenomenon. This is why the human child takes a lot of time to utter the expression I. If we could observe the development of a child, he or she would never confidently use the pronoun, but with slight confusion. Certain mastery is required to utter I. If I am a child, I would say, Dad, Robin needs a toy car. Only later, I need a toy car, right? A child first should be able to cut the stream of experience into subject and object. Then he should master a linguistic confusion to say because everyone in the house uses the same I, right? My parents, neighbors, etc. use the same I to refer to themselves. So we very slowly learn to use the pronoun I. Thereby we try to individuate and make the best possibility of the primordial or the very basic feature of experience, I. This complicated relation between primordial feature of our consciousness and the act of individuation take us to phenomenological project of Martin Heidegger. Heidegger is famous in both philosophy and literary theory for the expression like being in the world or being towards death or readiness to hand and presence at hand, etc. He has introduced his novel aspect concept and to both philosophy and literary theory in a colloquial language. His extraordinary work, Being and Time, is a beautiful description of the complicated and radical possibilities of the primordial aspect of consciousness, that is this mindness. He was very careful in choosing the word to express his thought and to propose his project of phenomenology. He has chosen a very ordinary German word, which falls within the scope of any German child, Dasein, to explore the primordial aspect of consciousness. Heidegger could have chosen any other philosophical terminologies like man, soul, mind, spirit, consciousness, or ego. But he did not. Instead, he has chosen a ordinary German word, Dasein, to problematize the primordial feature of experience. So we will be forced to ask, what is Dasein, or who is this Dasein? I think the best way to understand Heidegger's project of phenomenology is to ask why the word consciousness or mind wasn't enough for Heidegger. Dasein was an everyday word, and the everydayness of this word was exactly Heidegger's point. When Heidegger was giving a special emphasis to ordinary, the everyday word, he was actually calling our attention to a fundamental concept. He was telling us, see, you are not living up to the best possibility which your state of experience enables. And if we take up this call, that is, if we decide to examine the highest or the radical possibility that our primordiality opens up, Heidegger would give us the identity card of Dasein. To put it differently, Dasein is a being for whom its own conditions appears as a problem. Such a being is forced by itself to gather its possibilities in reference to its limit. Of course, in this activity, we may individuate. That's why Heidegger defined Dasein as a being towards death. The moment of death, the moment, very moment we are aware about death, we would render the minus or the formness of our experience to an I or an ego. we will split reality into subject and object. Heidegger will call such a state of affair the withdrawal of being. And Husserl's terminology is natural attitude. Let it be the withdrawal of being or natural attitude. What is discussed is the same. It points out the situation of our consciousness. Although I cannot be unconscious of my present experience, I may very well ignore it in favor of an object. In my daily life, I am absorbed and I preoccupied by the projects of and objects of the world. This absorbed state is known as the natural attitude or the withdrawal of being. So don't think that this withdrawal of being as something negative. It is not actually. For Heidegger, our everydayness or our being with other entity is not something negative. On the contrary, for Heidegger, when we try to individuate or to an I and refer to the rest of the reality as other or entity, the very possibility of relating to outside becomes the finest opportunity. This relation enables us to reach to the world. And Heidegger would say, this relationship opens us to the infinite possibilities. Let's try an example to understand this problem. Let us take the expression, the experience of enjoying a melody. In the moment a subject comes closer to a sonic sequence, the object, the melody is heard. Or when I burn myself on a candle, the phenomenon of pain takes place. In other words, when I encounter the world or an object, something more than what is present in the object as its property become manifested. Pain is never the property of an flame in itself. Phenomenology would say we cannot think the object in itself unless and until they are mediated to us through our relation to it. Our access to the world is mediated. And as I mentioned in the beginning, Descartes believed that our familiarity with the cogito is immediate and not mediated. For phenomenology, on the contrary, our experience of I and thinking as well as our access to the external reality is mediated through language and our bodily nature. This is why Heidegger and all other phenomenologists are trying to give an account of our relation to the world in terms of language and embodiment. Phenomenology will point out, and importantly, two kinds of mediation or our access to the world, language and body. And Heidegger would say, Dasein is the being who tries his best to reach out to the world of being through the limits of language and embodiment. Merleau-Ponty, another famous phenomenologist, has produced a detailed account of body and its dynamics in the production of knowledge and experience. For Merleau-Ponty, our ordinary purposive orientation of the body as a whole toward things and its environment defines the relation to the world. Earlier, we have seen the Kantian idea of I. For Kant, it is the formal reflection that gives shape to the I. Whereas for Merleau-Ponty, the constitution of I facilitates us to our own experience and the world, but it is the body. It is the body, not the formal reflection, which gives intentionality. The body, by projecting an aim towards which it moves, unifies us with the surrounding. Through the vectors of its projected possibility, body sets this in relation to one another and to itself. In his phenomenology of perception, Merleau-Ponty takes the task of articulating the primordial structure of existence, which are which are the ground of all reflective relation to the world. In asking how there can be a world for a subject, Merleau-Ponty reorients the entire tradition by locating subjectivity not in the mind or consciousness, but in the body. Merleau-Ponty would say the initial meaning giving act which orient us towards the world is constituted by the word body. There is a world for the subject just insofar as the body has capacities by which it can approach, grasp, and appropriate its surroundings in the direction of its intentions. I think we can summarize Merleau-Ponty's account of the body to a dictum. My body can, therefore I am. So how I can use my body defines myself. If Merleau-Ponty gives a detailed account of intentionality in terms of body and perception, the works of Heidegger, Derrida, and Paul Ricoeur invite us to think intentionality in terms of language and its complicated functions. For Derrida, intentionality is the possibility of language. And for Heidegger, man or Dasein dwells in language. Heidegger would say, language is the home of being. Derrida, in his introduction to Husserl's work, Origin of Geometry, articulates how language opens up the possibility of mathematics and history as well as imagination. For Derrida, the very geometrical discovery that the immediate distance between 2 points is a straight line, and its phenomenological interpretation that the straight line is the shortest distance, and most importantly, all the possibilities of literary imagination itself as the gift of language. I think how Derrida and Paul Ricoeur tries to describe the problem of metaphor, it's a good resource for us to explore the phenomenology of language. It is true that both of them, Ricoeur and Derrida, compete to think under the signature of Heidegger. However, as it is often portrayed, we should not think that they are debating, because there is hardly any opposing view between them. Heidegger says language is the home of being, and Derrida posits two questions to discuss the very metaphor that Heidegger produced. Derrida asks, what is going on today with the metaphor? And what gets along without metaphor? These two questions have influenced literary and philosophical debates of our period. To this question, what is going on today with metaphor? Derrida answers, everything. And to the question, what gets along with metaphor? His answer is nothing. Please allow me to quote him. Derrida says, what is going on today with metaphor? Well, everything. There is nothing that does not go on with metaphor and through metaphor. And what gets along without metaphor? He says nothing. This is a quote from his essay, The Retreat of the Metaphor. How should we understand these two answers? If nothing gets along with metaphor, that is, if our best efforts or the best effort of Heidegger to give an account of Dasein finally recourse to metaphor, saying language is the home of being, it tells us that from now on, only metaphor can guide us to the being, right? Allow me to quote once more, because we are discussing a very crucial and controversial problem. Derrida says, Heidegger's text appeared impossible to get around for others and myself from the moment it was a question of thinking. This is also the quote from the same essay, The Retreat of the Metaphor. Now, the distance between thinking and literary imagination becomes zero. Derrida is giving us resources to reflect why neither Heidegger nor we are able to write the second volume of Being and Time. In other words, when phenomenology or philosophy resorts to metaphor to do metaphysics, we go confused. Is metaphor a tool of literature or of phenomenology now? To answer, Derrida will quote Heidegger again. The metaphoric exists only within the boundaries of metaphysics. This is what Derrida would say by quoting Heidegger. In other words, in metaphor, in language, we mark the limit of our thinking. When we think through metaphor, what is really manifested is our finitude. This is why, for Paul Ricoeur, we should examine the psychological theory of imagination and feeling to understand what gets along with metaphor. Let's say, both in philosophy and in literature, when we are forced to speak in terms of metaphor, we are actually trying our best effort, to escape from the ordinary or the mundane relationship with the world and ourselves. And metaphor reveals, as burning reveals the pain which is not in the candle, the urge to escape from this everydayness. Sartre has captured this complicated anxiety, which is the threshold of every literary writing. For him, literary imagination opens up the possibility to address oneself to what is not. I think the recent French novel by Tristan Garcia titled Hate, a Romance is an excellent example here. In his novel, Garcia uses sex, friendship, and love affairs to show what happens to people when political ideas like Marxism, gay science, sexual liberation, nationalism come to an end. His novel was written against the trend for autofiction. He could successfully overcome the common expectation that novels should be based on something that writer or the society has lived through. His novel, on the contrary, addresses the deeply rooted potentialities of reality to the extent that they are absent from the actualities of everyday life. Thus, in the preface of the novel, Garcia writes, the characters in this novel have never existed never existed other than in the pages of this book. However, if the reader feels that in certain ways they resemble real persons whom he or she knows of, that is simply because other persons or characters would behave no differently under the similar conditions. I think this is the radical possibility that literature opens for us. Literature creates the finest details that are missing from reality. Literature locates the withdrawal of being, and then it invites us to respond to it. This radical possibility and its scope take us to the last point we wish to discuss: how contemporary phenomenology approaches literary text. To be more precise, how does phenomenology, in responding to the interdisciplinary demand, see literature? We are not discussing how literary criticism and literary theory see phenomenology, but just the opposite. Contemporary phenomenology, especially phenomenology which is motivated by psychiatry and cognitive science, sees literature as the vast repository of data about general structure of consciousness and its operations. For example, recently Professor Aaron Mishara, a psychiatrist interested in phenomenology, has opened up an excellent window to further the potentialities of phenomenology and literature. Professor Mishara uses the literary works of Kafka, and he invites us to think literary documents as the best records of cognitive processes. For contemporary phenomenology, literary works can supply resources to understand mental disorders, with an intimacy that is otherwise unavailable to neuroscience. For Mishara, Kafka's literary works are the excellent resources for psychopathology because Kafka suffered from dream-like hypnagogic hallucinations during sleep-deprived state of writing. Thus, Kafka's novels and short stories are the first-person records of cognitive and neural dysfunction, which can be assessed from a second-person perspective. So, to conclude, we pose three different sets of questions. First, we discussed the origin of phenomenology, the Kantian Copernican revolution, and the problem of finitude. Actually, that was the original, antecedent of phenomenology. Second, we discussed the main concept of phenomenology, something like natural attitude, the withdrawal of being, embodiment, and language. And finally, we discussed the relation between phenomenology and literature. We saw the phenomenological understanding of metaphor and how phenomenology understands the essence of writing, etc. We also saw how in the interdisciplinary avenues, phenomenology approaches literary textbooks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Now it's time to move on to the question and answer sessions. Sir, me and Sienna will be reading out the questions that are posted in the chat box. And if you have any problem hearing or understanding the pronunciations, please ask us to read it again and we will.
Sure.
Well, the first question.
Hello.
We can't hear you, Dan.
I think there is some connectivity issues. Hello, Dan.
Maybe somebody else can read out that question.
Sienna.
I think it's a question that Dr. Vimal John asked. Or maybe Vimal, you can just
maybe you can just ask me the question.
And ask the question directly.
Yeah, that
sure.
would be better.
Yeah. All right. Okay, let's do that then. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Robin, for that talk. So I'm afraid, again, my handicap in understanding philosophy is a little strong. So pardon me if I haven't been able to quite follow the trajectory of your talk. But in some sense, this is my takeaway. In some sense, then, according to what you say, isn't every form of communication and utterance communication through metaphor? This is something that is also validated by the general orientation of post-structural philosophy and so on, at least as we understand it, students of literature understand it. So if every form of communication and utterance is in some sense a communication through metaphor, particularly as we understand it in literature, how does phenomenology understand forms of literary expression, such as movements or works that deploy a style that we call impressionism or expressionism? Or to refer to what you were referring to at the end of your talk, what would best explain the kind of writings that we understand as Kafkaesque?
Okay, thank you so much for the question. I think that gives us a lot of resources to think what I could not say during my talk. Yes, everything, the being that who uses language, for him everything is an utterance, and also he moves and through expressions. So now the question that Heidegger or Derrida is putting for us is that, look, why this expression matters for us? Something like when a being like us who is gathered to, is trying our best to gather the best resources to express ourselves, seek the best expression of language and body. So this is, and only because the thing, now another problem is that, look, in a modern philosophy, we cannot say something like finite thinking or finite expression or finite communication, because communication, thinking, and expression, everything is finite in the first place, because only for a being who is finite is able to express, communicate, and utter. So in literary theory, as I have mentioned about, the famous, not famous very much, it's recently published novel, Hate and Romance. Why do we use literature, or why do we resort to metaphor? That is the question. And I think the Heidegger will say, for example, when Heidegger would say, language is the home of being, both the home and language is not allowing us to understand what exactly the being. See, that is a trope, right? So all metaphors are a perfect suspension of the available expression and its meaning, or available utterance. And how this suspension of available meaning take us to a different and radical meaning that is presupposed by metaphor, is the problem that every literary work tries to capture. So, for example, in literary theory or literary criticism, we will examine a particular literary work, and we will identify a particular metaphor, and we will find fault with it, right? And that is all. But there is a second stage where we would, as Professor Sanal mentioned yesterday, the fault finding business is not really critical business. So critical philosophy will also try to push, it will identify first what exactly is happening with that metaphor. And it will also, if it is not a literary critic, maybe a literary writer will invent a new metaphor, which is the best metaphor to capture that urge in us to break away from the ordinary meaning. So for me, something like all literary works are a footnote to this this moment where we suspend in the everydayness of utterance and expression, and tries to push a little more. And maybe in that moment we may go wrong, but that exactly captures our willingness to seek new expressions and communications. And also this is exactly what is happening with literature. I hope I have somewhere tried to address your problem, because you have asked a very complicated problem, something like what is literature in relation to expression and utterance. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Lois Joyce. She has asked, could you please throw some light on lived experience?
Okay. Lived experience. Yeah. So earlier I have mentioned that, from Kant onwards, the real task of thinking is to disclose what conditions our experience and knowledge. So now we have, after phenomenology, we have a new term, lived experience. So how does a experience becoming lived and lived? That is the question, right? So the question that answer that phenomenology will provide, you look, an experience become lived because I am able to own that experience. So if I burn myself on a candle, if I am not able to own that pain, then that experience is not mine. So this is what exactly make an experience lived, because it always appears to someone. It has always a subject in addition to what is happening around the experience. So that makes an experience totally lived. And maybe we can also think about our relation to the body, and also is quite immediate. But maybe in a social setup, where we live in a society or in intersubjectivity, we get to the experience is mediated through certain kind of different relations like sympathy or empathy, because that is also a way of buying others' experience as mine. So that gives an experience, a social experience lived. For example, the social experience of caste and faith, all are this kind of lived experience, because here the purchase is not happening directly in relation to my body, but rather it's language and body somehow enables us to buy the social reality as mine. So that's how, phenomenology will answer, because the lived experience is lived experience because it's mine, or maybe something like language and body somewhere help us to buy that experience as mine.
Thank you, sir. Now, the next question is from Anurag Bhattacharya.
Okay.
And the question is, how can we apply phenomenology in understanding reader response theory?
Yes, something like I didn't mention that in the lecture, but I think that's a very valid and very good question, because usually the phenomenological understanding of literary text is always correlated to, or we always understand in relation to reader response theory. And reader response theory is, as yesterday we have heard about in hermeneutics, is a different way of interpreting the text, or a different way of hermeneutic in the text. Here, look, we are approaching a text from our own perspective, and now we don't seek the intentions or the meanings that is supplied by the author. We already perform certain epoche, something like a bracketing. Then we suspend what the author is said, or what author is intended. Then we try to capture what is available to us from our perspective, something like our cultural background, our linguistic background. Then something new happens there. So because every time when we look, as we says about a particular something like an apple or something, we always see apple from one particular perspective, and the backside of the apple is not given to us. But we don't really doubt whether the apple has a backside. So the same way, the backside of the text, something like, if I say something like the author's intention is presupposed, but we deliberately bracket it out. Then we try to read it in terms of our experience, our body, our language, our cultural conditions. Then what happens? A new meaning is, maybe we will be able to give a new meaning, because every perspective is a different and unique purchase on the experience. So the way that, if the text is read in America, or the text is read in Kerala, it has to be different, because our perspective is different, because our cultural difference, our linguistical difference, and everything may add into, may facilitate a new reading. So this is actually what is happening with reader response theory, because rather than the response caricatured by the author, the reader is adding everything to the text, because each perspective is different and unique. So each reading will be different.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Dr. Dharmadhikari. She's asked, how will phenomenology help create meaning to remove misunderstanding and miscommunication?
Okay, this is, I think maybe I will be able to give an account of your question. Maybe, for example, in how phenomenology and feminism go, how phenomenology is, we have a phenomenological account on one side, and we have a feminist account of reality from that is another side. So in a beautiful work by Iris Marion Young, she writes, how phenomenological account can be used to account feminist theories. So the same way, we can say that, so can you just give me that question again, because I just lost my track.
Yes, sir. The question is, how will phenomenology help create meaning to remove misunderstanding and miscommunication?
Okay. So the problem, so when we have phenomenology in one side, and for Iris Young, something like we have feminism in other hand. So when we club together, usually what we do is we will describe how certain object is given to us from our perspective. But this may be something like misunderstanding, right? But here in this work, throwing like a girl, she tries to universalize that relationship. So she tries to universalize that experience. Now, the ordinary naive way of portraying my experience is not enough. Now I have to render this particular experience as a universal phenomena. There I have to push it, and I have to see it also from the perspective of the other. That is the task. So then, look, this misunderstanding will slowly wither away, because then we are forced by the intersubjective community or something like the other person to make some valid and a space for him within the scope of my purchase to the reality. So my minus will be questioned by other person, because now he demands us that we should experience and we should consider the reality as something like a universal fact. I think the best example will be something like Kant's account of categorical imperative, because now when I conduct myself, I cannot apply to, I cannot stick to my experience to with its misunderstanding. I am now forced to conduct my actions and my intentions in such a way that it will be a model for everyone in the world. So this is the task, it's for the very purchase of my moral intentions, my brute desires. When I make use of them to live in a particular society, I am forced to conduct that activity as a model for others. So the very presupposition that, the same reality is experienced by someone else, that information gives us to clarify, that information somehow pushes us to, clarify our very purchase to the reality. And then we slowly, with the presence of, by presupposing that there is also another person who would also has a different purchase to the same reality, we will slowly move on, and it will become evident from his own others' perspective that, what we were purchasing as minus may not be the right one. So that's how we clarify and clear the error and the mistakes and misunderstanding which is available to us from our perspective.
The next question is from Surya, and the question is, what is the objective existence of tool being in Heidegger's tool analysis in being and time?
Can you just repeat the question? Sorry.
Okay, sir. What is the objective existence of tool being in Heidegger's tool analysis in being and time?
Okay, thank you so much. So the famous, the expression that Heidegger gives is something like, I does not go to the world first as if there is something like a hammer outside there. So usually we think that, object hammer is there available, and then we have this need to hammer. But Heidegger would rather say, look, the idea of hammer is first, happens to us because we have this tendency to hammer. So hammering as a condition gives us access to a certain rock as the old form of a hammer. So this is how Heidegger would say, all our relation to the world is somehow connected through certain tooling, because we encounter the world outside not as something like objects that is presented or showcased as totally indifferent to us, but rather we find a rock as a hammer sometimes. So the very urge from us, how this rock appears is not a property that the rock is ready-madely giving to us, but rather this is a subject's urge to hammer something makes the possibility of rock outside. Then we gather, so we collect some objects from the external world to hammer. So this is how Heidegger would say, would unpack the complicated nature of our everydayness to the world. So by hammering, we have an object outside given to us as rock, or which means the purpose of hammer. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Girish C. He has asked, if the phenomenon itself is a metaphoric history of erotic experiences, does the very notion of mediated endeavor in phenomenology as a discipline delimit itself?
Can you just read out the last part
Yes, sir.
after the erotic?
Erotic experiences.
Okay.
Does the very notion of mediated endeavor in phenomenology as a discipline delimit itself?
Okay. So first of all, I deliberately used that phenomenology as not a discipline, because phenomenology is hardly a discipline. This is the tension that the reader also says, because now if phenomenology, in order to capture the primordiality and its highest possibility, is trying to resort to literature and metaphysics, literature or metaphor, there is hardly any tool left which is unique to phenomenology to encounter that being, right? So the very expression is something like, that's why Paul Ricoeur would say, look, the available theory of meaning is enough, but if we could push it a little bit by adding the psychology of feeling and emotions, look, then only we will come to know what exactly this metaphor or something like how this why this bracketing is really a matter to us. So so when we say that, look, this erotic expression and how does phenomenology relate to it, and whether phenomenology is delimited by the erotic expression, I think phenomenology would say, look, we don't have any other options. What we are doing is in one level is a suspension of our available meaning. And another one is whether we were successful enough to suspend this available meaning as like a metaphor does. But could this suspension actually take us to a suspense? Something like, okay, after this suspension, I am able to bang my head again is something like the being. But phenomenology so far would say that, look, we are not able to. That's why it will resort to the available tools from literature or from science or from technology to gather. And maybe phenomenology is not a discipline at all, first of all, because a discipline should have certain kind of technique and method to accomplish what it tries to give, right? But phenomenology here does not have any ready-made method, or maybe usually in the literature we would say that, look, epoch is a method, but epoch or the bracketing is not really a method because it's not successful enough. Only metaphor is able to able to suspend the available meaning, but not it is not able to deliver the original possibility of being. So something like, so whether something really delimits the concepts or working methodology of phenomenology is maybe not a good question to ask, because phenomenology as a discipline hardly exists. It only try to give an account of this finitude of the finitude, where we are pushing our limit to a certain extent, taking inspiration from the subject, something like it wants to suspend the ordinary experience. This is why I have mentioned the Garcia's work, because the ordinary is not enough. This is why we always do literature. And for example, in another, whenever we say we are really busy with the day and we are really occupied, we will say that, let us take a break. Then what do? We will go for a movie, or we will go for we will read a novel, right? Or something of that sort. Because the ordinary day, somewhere, the ordinary everydayness of the world, somewhere, make us sick, or it make us tired. And then we want to take a break. And this break is well addressed. It is taken, the break is taken by watching a movie or a literary work. And that actually captures all the tension, because now the literary work or the movie is really a new way to, it tries to portray the time in a entirely different way. And it orients the available, the ordinary life in from a different perspective. Because that's why, Trajan Garcia's work is very unique, because he's like, in a certain way, in Paris, in Germany, sorry, in France, that all episode occurred. But the reality of that, the reality, the empirical conditions of that episode was not good enough. Then, we are trying to give a more detail to it. We will detail it a bit. So when in this detailing, we will break from the ordinary charm, and then we will be able to see the all episodes that slowly unfolded in the history from a new perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next is 3 questions that have come from PJ Thomas, sir, our HOD.
Thank you.
The
Okay.
first question is, please say a bit more about the difference between Ponty and Husserl.
Okay.
The second question is, please say a bit more about the idea that the sign is towards death.
Okay.
And the third question is, I feel, experience, therefore I am. Will this be a dictum for phenomenology for layman? That's it.
Okay. I feel, experience.
It's
What?
I feel
No,
/
no, yeah, I think it should be I feel or I experience. Therefore, I am.
experience. Sorry.
Okay, I shall come to your first question. So, what would be the difference between Husserl's phenomenology and Merleau-Ponty? I would say that, look, there is hardly any difference, because the difference is not the question. Because how do Merleau-Ponty takes up the invitation of Husserl is the problem. So for me, something like, Husserl was enough, right? Husserl has already given a lot of discussion. He already discussed a lot about lived aspect of body, and also something like he has the expression like lived body and the ordinary body, like, which is not one among the entity in the world. But what Merleau-Ponty does is, he takes one aspect of Husserl's thought, then he tries to push it little more. Then, by that he is seeking more details about what Husserl already said. Then he says, like, look, then when Merleau-Ponty takes more details, then it becomes impossible for Husserl to hold his very fundamental discovery. Something like intentionality has a consciousness feature. Something like that's, the same happens with Heidegger too. Heidegger was quite happy with Husserl's project of phenomenology, but he would say, look, it's fine. We all are individuated, and maybe that will take to the second question too. So we all are individuals, and we always appreciate ourselves as, and we always posit ourselves as ego. Okay, quite fine. But is it the ego the highest possibility that the primordialness or the mindness allows? Heidegger was a time where, he used in the first of all, in the first part of the Being and Time, he defines Dasein in relation to his death consciousness, isn't it? In our life, nothing else can be really owned by other than death. Death is quite unique. It happens only to me. Nobody else has a purchase on my death. So this is this death, death experience or a reflection about death makes me an individual. It helps me to individuate. That takes us to your second question, something like, what is the relation between Dasein and death? Always Dasein find itself in the world and it individuate itself in relation to its awareness about the death. And the last question, I think I would agree with you, because how do I feel? It feel, when I feel, two conditions are, it presupposes two conditions, because I feel always within the limit of my body. I also feel within the limit of my language, right? So the limit, what body tells us and what language tells us, and how do we capture these possibilities of both the language and body really constitute what I am. So I think, every phenomenologist will be very much happy to take your dictum. Look, I feel, therefore I am.
Okay, sir. The next question is from Abida. And the question is, what is the difference between being, capital B, and being, small b?
Okay, thank you. I think one should not answer that question because it's not because that, look, I have a certain answer within, answer all whether the phenomenological tradition has a answer, then we are hiding it from such a question. But rather, actually nobody knows what actually the capital being is, because we are told about the capital being, something like the being as a whole, from our day-to-day acquaintance with the entities, something like beings, the small beings. And it somehow tells us that, look, there is also a different possibility altogether. Rather than considering being as being, we will be able to see a different absolute possibility of some other perspective. And we hardly know what is that perspective. That's why I said, look, metaphor is able to suspend the available our available consideration of other people, others as being and entities, and we are able to suspend it. But what then happens? What it should, actually what happens should be something like a being has to appear. But either we are not able to suspend it into very rigorous detail, or we are not our very conditions does not allow us to capture that being in the capital being. So the question is something like, why Heidegger never had a second volume of being would be this difficulty. Otherwise, he could have easily, maybe he might have posed that as an easy problem. I don't think so, but yet we can think like that. It was something like he was giving a detailed account how Kant framed this idea of reflective unifying act, and then Husserl's idea that, look, it is intentionality. It really frames this our day-to-day access to the world. And finally, then he takes this all questions in one by one, and then he says, look, maybe we should really should really describe the capital being, as you said. But then the second volume never came out. He had enough time to work it on, but I think that's why Heidegger also says, look, if there is a criticism of phenomenology, and if you really feel like, look, there is some kind of mistakes with, or some kind of errors in the phenomenological discourses, the real criticism now should not be something like a fault finding business, but rather you should take up that very task of thinking, which should not get in the bag against the being, but rather to capture the original being. So everyone who finds a difficulty with phenomenology, Heidegger would say, look, now the difficulty, can you correct this difficulty? Or maybe can you invent a new metaphor where not only the suspension of everydayness is happening, but also which gives a glimpse to the noumenal world or the I. So the being, we hardly know what is the real meaning of this word capital being. We only know that, look, the small being, the entities are giving some kind of, and our experience with this entity are somehow and somewhere gives us some kind of signpost to read what would be the absolute being. But we hardly know what exactly it is.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Naresh Sharma. He has asked, so what's the basic difference between phenomenology and ontology? What's the hermeneutical phenomenology? Okay. How do phenomenological theorists apply it to literary text? Sir, I think a secondary focus of the phenomenological theorists is the self. So that's the whole thing. Should I read it again?
Can you just read out the second part?
Yes, sir.
So after this ontology, then it will
what's hermeneutical phenomenology? Then how do phenomenological theorists apply it to literary texts? Then it's a statement, sir, I think a secondary focus of phenomenological theorists is the self.
Yes, okay. Thank you. So I shall begin with the last point you mentioned. Yes, of course, phenomenology begins with, and phenomenology starts the encounter with the world from this side, right? The subject side, not from the object side. There is also a different new tradition that is coming up, something called object-oriented philosophy, something like where this phenomenology or Kantian philosophy, when if it is subject-oriented, then this another tradition is there something like object-oriented. But phenomenology always will say, look, see what does really this object-oriented business adds to. What does it really reveal? For example, as I said, I mentioned above earlier, something like whenever when we burn ourselves on a candle, we feel pain, right? And this pain is not a property of the object itself. So, but it was something that as a product of this correlation, subject-object correlation. And if you are really trying to capture, and if you insist that, look, this correlational byproduct can be only attained from an object-oriented perspective, then phenomenology would say, look, unless and until there is a subject, this byproduct of correlation would never appear, right? So see, it will say that, look, our available features and concepts provided by phenomenology is enough, because whenever we experience something, we experience the object, but we experience always from the perspective of the subject, and this subject perspective really adds something to this entire correlational activity. So something like for the subject would be the the privileged position to know what exactly the product of this correlation. So I think that answers your the last part of your question. And another one is, how do we apply these phenomenological concepts to literary works and literary theory? I think I have already mentioned that in my presentation that, see, as a phenomenologist or somebody who has been familiar with phenomenology, I can only say how phenomenology sees literature. If a literary critic or a literary theorist like to apply this concept to literary theory, I think the entire task is on his shoulder. And maybe this also tells us another thing, another feature about our entire thinking and also being. Because now look, you have framed a very beautiful question: how can I apply or relate to phenomenological concepts from the perspective of literary theory or literary works, right? So this is our basic, or something like the prime concern. How can I apply, or how can I find a very beautiful relation? So that's what exactly phenomenology also tells. Look, we immediately seek some kind of relation with the world. If suppose an object is given to us and we hardly know how it is connected to us, we would never purchase that object. There is no buy for us, in that case. So something like your question is really valid. Something like, how we should really apply the phenomenological concepts in literary theory and literature. But phenomenology won't tell anything for you, because now that's how literary theory or literary critics has to individuate. In that sense, it is the entire burden is on the shoulders of literary theory, because now it has to invent new mechanism to relate to the phenomenological theory. And another one is the question about phenomenology and ontology. I think ontology is the question about what is, right? And phenomenology would say, look, as I mentioned about Kant, look, hold on for a while. Why do you ask this question? Have you really checked your presuppositions? In order to ask what is, first I should clarify the perspective from where something appears as existing, right? Then if you really push it further, then the empirical conditions that we really cash it out in terms of originality of experience and existence may not be the right conditions. Something like, that's why something like the ideality is coming out. So phenomenology will resist taking the ontological question first. Then it will say, look, in order to posit an ontology of being, we should first clarify its presuppositions, its conditions, what enables us to ask this question. At the same, at this juncture, the problem about language, how language is in conditions our access to the world and body, everything is coming up. That's why phenomenology is deferring that question, what is, because it always will defer, because its prime concern is not with the object in itself, but rather how this object is given to us from a perspective of the subject. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next question is anonymous, and his question is, connected to your response on lived experience, could you please throw some light on mystical experience which is transcendental in nature?
Thank you so much. You mentioned mystical experience, right?
Yes,
Hello?
sir.
Okay. Okay. So basically, then this is a question that tries to relate phenomenological concepts and method in terms into mysticism. And how would mysticism become a problem for phenomenology? That is another way of seeing the problem, right? So I think, look, usually there is a valorizing aspect happens with mysticism, right? Then in the object, we resist to, if phenomenology is trying to address the noumenal I or the world in itself through its relation, and if it bangs, if it meets a difficulty, therefore it is not able to capture the thing in itself or the noumenal I, mysticism is just playing another different game with the object of experience. Maybe it would slowly, and it don't want to indulge itself into its own limit. So that's why, mysticism would say something like, okay, this object is available there, and I think that my experience won't enable me to encounter that object of experience in itself. In that sense, something like a slight withdrawal from my experience is happening in terms of in favoring the object, rather than the subject is taking risk to seek the object of experience within its limit. Where mysticism would say, look, I don't really want to indulge myself into this, in the articulation of limit, and then to get into this object of my experience. Because something like, though it is something like a given from the subjective of the subject, it somewhere resists that urge in us to know the thing in itself. So somewhere in between, I would rather say, mysticism is a failed phenomenology, because we could not even see a the slight urge in a mystic, because he always given up. He always given up the world, because now he thinks that I can. So, and he is enjoying this giving up of his best effort. This is what I think. This is how I would see the phenomenological and the endeavor and the mystic endeavor.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from PJ Thomas. He has asked, Kant moves on from epistemology to ontology. Where do you place phenomenology in this?
Okay, thank you so much, sir. Again, I said, look, when Kant gives an account of I in terms of reflective consciousness, something like reflective thinking, Kant would, something like, then what phenomenology does is like, it details that possibility. Then it comes to realize that, look, that is not enough. Something like the reflectiveness of our reflectiveness, which enables us to shape our relation to the world, has a prior acquaintance with something else. And that point is explored in terms of body and language, right? So there is no disagreement. As I said, look, there is no disagreement with phenomenology and Kant. Kant himself did not something like, he did not try to explore the possibility of body and language, but rather he was happy with the idea of sublime, something like the reality hits on my eye and it breaks my available categories of knowledge. So such a kind of experience was enough, and he was pursuing such a kind of experience and occasions in life. But rather, phenomenology says, look, it already agrees with what what Kant says and what Kant pursues. But it would say, look, what really allows that experience, and what really allows to account that experience, that has to be now cast in terms of language and our acquaintance with the body, and how the body allows us to interact with the world. So I think one completes and fulfills other. The phenomenology really fulfills, and it really meets the demands or something like the problems that Kant could not take it up. So there is no disagreement. I think everything, all this fit in very well in the history of philosophy.
Next question is from Pummi Sharma, and he's asking, can you suggest some books to know more about object-oriented ontology?
I think the Harman's works, and also something like, what exactly troubles both subject-oriented philosophy and object-oriented philosophy can be read from the works of Quentin Miyazu. The After Finitude will be a beautiful introduction to the tension that, why we should quit this subject-oriented philosophy to favor an object-oriented turn. I think Miyazu's work, After Finitude will be a good resources to take up that one. And also Habermas, the idea, how Habermas take the idea of tool and from Heidegger, and how he uses that to develop a different ontology of object, would be another book to look on.
Thank you, sir. PJT sir has come with one more question.
Okay.
Can there be experience beyond and without the world?
So, yeah, so here what I like to clarify is the expression world. If world is if we are trying to capture the world in terms of empiricity, empirical conditions, then look, phenomenology or transcendental philosophy is an invitation to transcend this limit of empirical conditions. So the world now has a different meaning, right? Now, world can be also a world of objects, not only a world of objects. It can be a world of idealities. It can be a world of emotions. It can be a world of feelings. So that gives us that, look, when we transcend, I would say, transcend from the limit of our empirical conditions, then entirely a different meaning of world is also appearing. Something like society is a different world, and in a natural order we cannot see a society, right? So society is open, something like when we transcend the bounds of empirics, then we get to see a different meaning attached to the world, to the expression world. So that's why we say, look, human language and human body are world constituting, because that world is no more the natural order. That's why we seek normativity of laws, not in the natural order. If we seek normativity of moral laws in the natural order, we would hardly find anything, because the entire natural world is contingent. There is no guarantee that tomorrow and day after tomorrow, this and their gravity may fall off, because we don't know, because gravity is not a necessary property of an atom or an entity. But so in the entire empirical world, it's only fully contingencies. Now that's why Hume would come and say, look, we cannot really find out what actually a cause is. We will always see a ball hitting another one and it's moving out. We don't know what exactly causes it. Only our habit tells us that, look, it may happen so. But the only ability is to this habit. So if we really cross this, and this is why we seek the normativity not in the contingent world. We don't refer to seek, whenever we refer to seek more to know about the moral order, moral law, we don't refer to natural order, because now for a human being, a different originality is available out there, which is not empirical. That has to be constituted through the intersubjectivity, something like, it has to presuppose another, and a different dynamics and the complications are brought in, rather than the contingencies or now we don't encounter the world in terms of natural order or empirical reality, because entirely new world, idea of world is constituted. So something like, what exactly matters here, how do we really understand the expression world? Whether should we think about in terms of empirics, or we should think about in terms of some the subjective aspect, something like the moral law and its urge to seek outside the domain of available and natural order.
Okay, sir. Next question is from Krishnapriya S. And her question is, how can we connect phenomenology and actors' embodiment in theater?
Can you just reread?
Okay, sir. How can we connect phenomenology and actors' embodiment in theater?
I think I would say I may not be able to take that question because it requires a lot of knowledge about the theater and how in film studies, and maybe I may not be the right person to answer that question, because the best I have given the some kind of glimpse about the other question who asked about reader response theory. So, but here I may not be able to answer you, because I hardly know what is the film studies says about emotions and things like, and how it may portray the arrangement of time in a different way. So I hardly know how to answer that one. So can we take a last question? Then we will.
Okay, sir. Sir, we have a last question here with us. It's from Sarjan. How does phenomenology conceptualize sexuality?
Again, see, I think I will again refer to the another work that I mentioned by Iris Young, Throwing Like a Girl. She really does that one, because she asked the question, see, when we account for a body of the feminine body, what should be the what should really guide us to explore such a body? Then something like the anatomical features are not enough. Then that's how, because we know that gender is performative, right? So this performance should be addressed not in terms of a biological body, but rather it has to be thought in terms of something more than that. How we really transcend this biological body, portraying the idea of this man who is free being. Then how, especially in the case of feminism, we regress again back to an empirical aspect, saying that, look, woman has to be objectified by the gaze. So this dynamism is there. So maybe I think I may not be able to say how really the sexuality is portrayed in phenomenology, and maybe how a phenomenology of sexuality is possible. But rather, I think I would say, look, maybe reading Iris Young's work, How Throwing Like a Girl, would be an opportunity. It will give resources to think about it. Thank you.
So, one more question, please.
Okay, sure.
Okay. Can you say a bit about the relation between phenomenology and creativity?
So I think we have already answered that question, right? When we think about literary works, we are already thinking in that paradigm, right? Something like what exactly the creativity. Creativity in literary, whenever it comes to literary text, I have already two occasions. Something like detailing the everydayness. Then we will come again is something like a break of this everydayness. Another one is to seek out how to invent a new method, something like a new way of breaking this everydayness. So one is the detailing, another one is inventing new tools and mechanisms to break this everydayness. I think literature does this one. That's why we always resort to literature to take a break. It's because it gives us that kick of freeing ourselves from the ordinariness, everydayness of life. So that's the creativity. So maybe a literary critic who is also a literary writer will invent a new metaphor, something like if O.V. Vijayan, who is also a literary critic and also a literary writer, with his familiarity with literary criticism and how other literary writers use metaphors and other literary tools to do this suspension, may find some kind of fault with them, and within his genius, he may invent a new vocabulary and a new way of doing this suspension. And maybe something like Legends of Gaza could be an opportunity to see how this really works, where something like both literary critic as well as literary writer coincide in such a scene, and what opportunity it really gives us. Something like we may be able to see that by closely reading Legends of Gaza. So something like creativity, this is what I like to say about creativity and phenomenology, because phenomenology does not offer us to do a new mechanism. It does not offer new tools to do creativity, but rather phenomenology gives us to an account of this creativity. Something like what really you do when you are a genius in literary work. You really suspend the everydayness, something the mundane aspect of our life. Then you are trying to invent a new possibility of life. So that's why we always take a break to literature or movie. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Sir, there is a single question from Father Teddy. He asked if you're willing to answer it. It'll be the last.
Sure.
Yes, the question is, could you please explain intentionality in phenomenology and literary theory?
Intentionality in phenomenology and literary theory. I think I would really repeat my answers, because see, look, when we say that, look, there is a different there is no new idea of intentionality or new mechanism of intentionality is not produced by phenomenology. That's why it resort to, as the reader says, look, Heidegger, with his best effort, the best effort, that Heidegger offers to think about being, could only open up another one metaphor, something like language is the home of being. Something like, when this entire the dimension of metaphysics and metaphoricity is explored, he could not resist himself and he failed to explore it in itself. But instead he chose the same metaphor, another metaphor to express what he wanted to say about metaphors. It's something like a paradox, right? Something like you define something, then you incorporate the key term within the definition itself. So which means that it cancels out, because there is also already a black spot, something like within the definition itself, because it has to be really explaining what it is trying to define, but now it has already dropped in. So the same way, the best effort of Heidegger only captures, and it ends up with another metaphor. And now we hardly know whether because it's already suspended, whenever it says like language is home of being, the ordinary understanding of language and ordinary understanding of home is already suspended. Now we are clueless how to capture it. And only when this cluelessness can be portrayed in terms of certain psychology or anxiety or mood, then we will get into this idea of being. So I think this already, I think I am trying to answer it, because phenomenology does not give you a new resources of new method or new possibility of intentionality. It may say that, look, intentionality has a different and entirely complicated structure of experience and body. This is famous, this Mallarmé's question is very famous, like who speaks in language. So we are spoken, we are spoken by language. So something like the intentionality that phenomenology gives you, provides, is only an account of what is really already happening in both in literature, technology, and film studies and everything, and also in the day-to-day life. Because it does not give you a new opportunity. It may push you to seek a new one, but phenomenology in itself is not an answer, because that's why in a phenomenology, if it could answer something, a new intentionality, then in a Heidegger could have easily given another account of being in a second volume of being and time, because he could really know, he knew that something, what is the meaning of this capital being, because he hardly know, none of us know. So intentionality, the account of intentionality provided by phenomenology is always parasitic to other discipline, because it always can look into some other disciplines, literature or some other discipline, and then it gives an account of that one. It does not give you a new method or mechanism to break this charm of everydayness. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Is it noise coming? Okay. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for your patience and listening to all these questions. We got a lot of wonderful questions. We ensure the participants that the questions that are unanswered will be forwarded to the speaker. Now I move on to Sienna. Over to you.
Okay, done. Now I invite Mr. Philip Jones from the Department of English, St. Berkeley's College, to deliver.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Thank you, thank you. Hello, everyone. It's my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks at the end of this meaningful academic exercise. Well, we have been listening to Dr. Robin's illuminating lecture. Dear Doctor, we owe a great deal to you for unpacking, some of the intricate concepts of phenomenology for us, and also for clearing up some of our pressing doubts. You were really patient enough to take, many questions. Thank you so much for that. It was indeed a well-organized and meaningful talk. Let me, on behalf of the Department of English, St. Beckman's College, and our academic fraternity and sorority here, express my deep sense of gratitude to you, dear sir.
Thank you so much for the thank.
Yeah.
I also like to express my gratitude to Professor P.J. Thomas and
Yeah.
Rajesh, and also the Department of English, because
Yeah.
it has been very nice to come here and give an to share my reflections on phenomenology with you. Thank you so much, Professor PJT, and
Yeah,
also for your question too. It was very nice answering and also taking up that questions. Thank you.
Yeah. So next, let me also thank our beloved principal, Dr. Jacob Matthew, for his unstinted support for all our academic endeavors. Thank you, dear sir, for all your support and goodwill towards this program. Let me thank our zealous HOD, Professor P.J. Thomas, for taking great pains to organize programs of this kind. Well, our HOD has been offering, a rich academic treat for all of us by roping in experts from diverse areas and organizing seminars of good quality. Let me express my heartfelt thanks to you, dear sir. Let me also place on record my gratitude to all the faculty members who have been working as a reliable support system, for all these programs and contributing in various ways. Thank you, dear professors. Thank you so much. Let me express my heartfelt love and gratitude to all the students who have been taking care of the, technical side, comparing, and also the Q&A sessions. Thank you so much for your honest support. And let me also thank all the participants for their interest and active participation in the program. Meet you all virtually again for the next talk. Thank you and have a great time. Thank you.